We shift the brain, and instead of developing the reason, the competence, the things that we do, and focus on how well do I communicate? Am I a good collaborator? Am I empathetic? Do I have a high level of emotional intelligence? That's right brain development. There's a lot of space. And what I found is one is meant to work with the other, yet we're too focused on this, not focused on the right side of the communication.
Chuck Garcia, it is good to have you back on the show today.
Thank you, Angie. Good to be here.
Yeah, I know last time you were here, we were talking about, you were actually in the process of finishing this book. And so I was excited to have you back here. And, you are known out there from a leadership perspective. And I'll reference your first podcast in the notes for anyone who hasn't heard that yet. But you're really known from a leadership perspective. And when I put my hands on your new book, The Moment That Defines Your Life, I was kind of waiting for the leadership aspect. And of course, it's there as part of leadership. But you really brought together two of my favorite subjects. And you're talking about this emotional intelligence component, which is obviously in leadership, but also stoicism, which I'm like, what? Like he combined the two of these together, like he's speaking my love language now. So I really want to dig into this, but start us off with what gave you the idea to put something out like this?
When I started Angie, my coaching business, what people associated me to was my public speaking skills. And only because in my career, the majority of people who saw me on stage recognized, wow, this guy's pretty good at that. And I was handed an opportunity in the Bloomberg years where I didn't expect it, didn't know it was coming, but the opportunity presented itself. And I had no choice but to treat it like a craft, to take it very seriously. And yet, when I started my leadership practice and I was teaching people to do the very thing they asked me to do based on what they had seen from me, what I found is when I was coaching people to speak, to step on stage, to use the rhetorical techniques that I described in my first book, A Climb to the Top, there were certain, let's just say, students of mine at the executive level, it wasn't working. I was like, what the heck's going on? And part of my rhetorical techniques are using something called the rule of three, that if you have a lot to say and you eat a bowl of Rice Krispies, just tell them snap, crackle, and pop. Or if you talk about what are your favorite rock bands, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Electric Light Orchestra, and Earth, Wind, and Fire. Keep it simple, keep it accessible. Don't blow people away with information. So in my book, I have 10 commandments of great communicators. But here's where it changed, Angie, and now I'll answer your question. And that's a little bit of one way to recognize what I found. I wasn't teaching people to step on stage and to speak like me. Not that I expect them to speak like me, but I expected them to use my techniques. Here's what happened. I'm helping them to face their fears. I'm helping them to understand that it's not about the number of mistakes you made, but it's your ability to adapt from those mistakes. And what I found is as I was working with people, I began to see they're not very self-aware. They're not even socially aware. And I began to, now in my mind, I began to see the vision of the 4 domains of emotional intelligence, of self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, and relationship management. And what I found is, oh my goodness, I have to completely swing to another space and help them get the evidence, relevance, and the consequence of why EQ is important, because I wasn't just training them to present from the outside layer. I needed to get inside and understand what made them tick. How do I do that? Once I started to measure their emotional intelligence, people began to say, oh my God. First, I had no idea. Second, I didn't think you could measure this. And third, if we can associate learning tactics to the improvement of each of those domains, Angie, what do you think happened? They started getting better. Once they found the perspective inside, oh, I recognize my fears. I know I have to face them. I could either run from them or I could try to work with them. And suddenly now the ideas began to germinate. I think I have a different approach on what would be book 2, where book 1, A Climb to the Top, was very audience facing, or if not necessarily a large stage. You show up for dinner, it's the same tactics. You meet one, you meet many. Now, Angie, the idea was very much formed from, okay, I can now juxtapose communication skills to emotional intelligence. But my challenge was, and I've read just about every EQ book out there, what can I write about that's going to be different than every other EQ book? And this is where the integration of emotional intelligence, the stoicism, came in, because it was now a philosophy I could help people understand, using philosophy as a guiding set of principles to recognize when things aren't going well, rather than trying to make decisions from intuition, instinct, and even impulse. What if we could immediately go to the mind, and the mind could begin to control the thoughts? And if you can do that and stay calm under the weight of all these things that are going on, hence the idea for the origin of the book was to combine and integrate the juxtaposition of EQ and stoicism.
I love it. I mean, I feel like you just wrapped up the whole podcast in that one answer right there.
I appreciate that. Well, I think the important part, and I think, Angie, not just because I had something that I wanted to convey to an audience, stoicism to me is quite misunderstood, and I have to admit I didn't quite understand it in my earlier years. I thought stoicism was unfeeling, when in fact it's quite the opposite. It's the recognition that we do feel, and we should feel, and it's encouraging to feel, because as human beings, we feel first, we think second. Yet I thought about, Angie, in my education, who ever talked about how I felt? No one ever taught me. They wanted to know what I'm thinking, what I score, can I get an A? And yet, through all of our ups and downs throughout the entire schooling, when did anybody ever help us to get in touch with those feelings? Never.
Yes.
And I thought, or at least, where do I go for help? I'm trying to get people to understand that it's okay not to be okay. And you don't always need a therapist. I'm not talking about mental disorder or anxiety, depression. Maybe people have some of that. But I was just a regular guy in school with maybe slightly average intelligence and a strong work ethic. Yet when I got into the working world, I found it was okay. But it was the navigation of the unpredictability of people and the pressure that I was often under, with great expectations for the titans on Wall Street that I worked for. Oh my God, how do I manage that? And it wasn't until I discovered this wonderful philosophy called stoicism, that I thought was something weird, to this social science called emotional intelligence. And I said, I think I'm onto something. How do I explain it? And then the idea for the book was born.
I love it, because I think you have people out there that are really in those two camps, but separately. You know, you have these people who are really in this area of, you know, emotional intelligence and living and breathing that, and almost so much so that it can fall to one side a little heavily, right? And then you've got people on the stoicism side who really do, I don't know if they're misdefining that word, but they really are like rock solid with their thought and their feelings, and there's so much ownership in there. So to bring both of these together and to sprinkle a little bit of each together seems like a genius idea. And I found that it is.
Thanks.
But what really jumps out to me is the fact that, and we had a little bit of this conversation earlier, is that we're taught things. And even in your first book, right, it's very tactical. Like, here's step one, step two, here's the things that you can do. So I believe that we are groomed that way, right? Take in how to do things, understand step one, step two, execute. But we miss kind of the autonomy of understanding, how do we think on our own? What do we do with this information? How do we make it our own? How do we navigate it when that set of, you know, steps is out of order, or something kind of gets in the way, maybe somebody else's opinion or feelings? And that's really what I see in this book, is that you're teaching people how to have some autonomy with their learning and how they show up, but also there's an edge of like responsibility with that.
Yeah. When I consider our formal education, what you're describing certainly has its merit. We all want to learn to do whatever it is, particularly if you think about your college major. You want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, banker, oh, whatever that is, vet, it doesn't matter. But I felt, Angie, at the age of 22 when I graduated from college, all of that was behind me. And short of graduate school, which took a couple years, the majority of our adult life is not spent in any formal education setting. Okay. So rather than thinking about, I'm never going to go back into a classroom, there is a level of accountability as it relates to our own development, and we get to choose it. Now, you could do nothing. You could go home every day and watch Netflix, which some people do, and I appreciate that. But that wasn't me. I felt such a gap in my education when I got out of school. I started to read all these self-help books. How to Win Friends and Influence People had a massive impact on me. A book called How to Master the Art of Selling, another book. It was a game changer. And then I read a book several years ago called The Art of the Good Life by a guy named Rolf Dobelli. And it talked about biases and blind spots. And when I think about each of these books, and I read them again and again and again, and they became this habitual teacher in my mind. There was not one book I ever had in college that I wanted to read again, or that I wanted to read that was like a Bible, like a how-to. Angie, when you talk about autonomy, I read a book several years ago called Life is in the Transitions. It was written by a guy named Bruce Feiler. And what Bruce talked about after many years of observing what people want out of their lives, after a high school reunion that was very revelatory, he began to see, in spite of people's dreams, to many people didn't work out quite the way he wanted. And what he came to conclude is what people want three things called the ABCs of life. A for agency, B for belonging, and C for sense of cause. So as I thought about that frame, the belonging many people come from, religious institutions, sports teams, whatever that community is you belong to, seems like we have that. Many people find a cause, many adults do, whether it's climate change, ending world hunger, or even just being a good neighbor. There's a cause. But when it came to agency, our educational model put us through a very conforming, compliant system. Not a bad thing. That's the way you achieve scale in education. But I found as I was writing the book, and I started to help people face their fears, they wanted that agency. They wanted the autonomy. They wanted to feel free in their careers. But it was the fear of actually trying to do something different that jumped out of the only model they ever knew. Oh my God, how do I achieve that? And when I consider the effect that many people are communicating to me when they read the book, they said, I never quite saw EQ or stoicism that way. And they began to free the mind and to use that as motivation for, I think I can do the thing that scares me to death, but now I actually have a philosophy and a social science that can help me get more comfortable in the discomfort of that thing I'm leaning into, but is fearful. And so I think a lot of the book was written in response to those and to trying to find a creative way that stuck to the science and the philosophy, yet helped people see themselves in the stories.
So that, I mean, just hearing the success of people reading the book and going, now I think I can face these fears. Now I think I have a better idea. What does that look like for people listening who aren't in the book right now? You know, what, without going back to the old education model of, well, here's 1, 2, 3, you know, how can somebody start to embrace that agency, you know, some of their EQ or stoicism to do that themselves?
Yeah. I ask listeners to think about, who do you speak to the majority of time on any given day? And the answer is yourself. And what is it you say to yourself throughout the day when you think about, what am I going to do today? How am I going to make today a good day? What I learn, I'm not a big sports fan, but what I learn from the high-achieving athletes is they talk about not the distinction of their technical competence. I'll lean on Rafael Nadal, a great tennis player. And he says, everyone I play is as good as me at the game of tennis. But he said, you know why I win? Is because I work very hard to win the battle of the negative thoughts that invade my mind every time I make a mistake. And he said, if you don't learn to control those negative thoughts, they control you. So instead of defeating my opponent, I end up defeating myself. Now, let me take that sports metaphor out of the equation to those of us that are never going to win a Grand Slam in tennis, and I'm one of them. I remember throughout my career ascent, often the conversation I had with myself was self-doubt. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't look good enough to step on stage. I don't have the clothes. I found a million reasons to tell myself. And then I slapped myself silly. What am I doing? Why am I even bringing a negative thought in here when this is mine to control? My capacity to improve my craft. No one is going to control that for me. There's a million things in the world that I can't control, which is just about everything in front of me. But there's one thing I can, and that's the inputs that I have into my mind. That is it. In fact, Angie, I'd say from any given day, I don't focus on outcomes. I don't focus on the goals necessarily. All I do is minute to minute, I focus on what am I doing that's going to get me to the goal. And every moment that I have that is negative, that is inhibiting the progress, is inhibiting my capacity to get to the very thing I don't want to talk about, and that's achieving the goal. And I think I say that, Angie, because many of the people that I work with, they just stop and shudder about all those things that are in the way. And I ask them, how many of them can you remove? Well, none. Well, then why are you worried about it? Well, because, and they start giving me a million reasons why. It's not their fault. No one ever taught us how mindset, motivation, and method. Think about these 3 M's. What's my mindset toward what I want to do? Forget the skill set. We're so focused on skills that no matter how harder you work at your skill, maybe you'll get it 1 fraction of 1% better on any given day. I think that's misguided. If we shift the brain and instead of developing the reason, the competence, the things that we do, and focus on how well do I communicate? Am I a good collaborator? Am I empathetic? Do I have a high level of emotional intelligence? That's right brain development. There's a lot of space. And what I found is one is meant to work with the other, yet we're too focused on this, not focused on the right side of the communication. So the call to action here, I recognize whoever is reading the book. I am trying to find a way for you to identify to the 8 people whose stories I narrated in the book. I knew this book was working when many people called me or wrote a review on Amazon and Goodreads and said, now I finally began to relate to someone I can understand who is going through what I'm going through. What Chuck did is he described the story. He provided a framework for how to use EQ or stoicism to reframe the story in my mind that if this ever happens again, I may not get it all right, but I'll probably be a little smarter than I was before this. And that's, Angie, when I looked at Goodreads and Amazon for people I never knew, and I started to see what they were saying, it was like 4th of July. My goodness, it worked because they now had a prescription, a framework or something that will help them the next time that happens. Instead of facing the same adversity, they now have a way to get through it.
You talk about the right and the left brain, and you'll hear people say that, right? Like, oh, I'm right brain dominant or left brain dominant. So I don't know enough about like the true science behind, do we really have this dominant side and merging them together? But that's what I hear you saying now is this is a way to bring them both together. And it's necessary in order to have that blend in order to succeed. You got to have a little bit of both. So when we think about it from a tactical standpoint, if somebody is saying, well, I'm really right brain dominant or I'm really left brain dominant, what does that merging of the two look like? What can they do?
I think we are left brain dominant not because it comes from nature, but it comes from nurture. It's what we are told is going to help us to succeed. You're going to learn to be a doctor, sure. Learn biology, anatomy. My 2 best friends are doctors. But one of my best friends who's a doctor, what makes him an extraordinary physician is not the anatomy, the physiology, or the chemistry. I know when he walks in, because I've been on rounds with him, he's a gastroenterologist, so he treats people with liver disease. I know, Angie, when he walks into a room and his bedside manner is extraordinary. He not only explains the anatomy, the physiology, here's what's happening with your liver. He feels the pain of the patient. He begins to communicate with the patient in accessible tones that the patient can understand. If the patient is a child, there's a mother and a father sweating bullets at the explanation, trying to make sense of why it is my child has a disease. My friend, his name is Joe Galati, he's in Houston, Texas, my closest friend. It is remarkable. This was a doctor who made up his mind, if I'm going to be an extraordinary physician, I have to go beyond the left brain. So what did he work on? His own development beyond med school, which didn't teach him that. How do I walk into a room and immediately begin to identify with someone in pain? The physicians or any profession that dismisses that as irrelevant, that's not going to make you any less competent. But let's flip the equation. If working on it can make you a more valuable professional, and I'll take doctor out of it, it doesn't matter whatever that is, well, where does that lie? That's the right to brain development. And if school only focused on left, okay, get out of college, what now? We have the agency to figure out what we want to further develop. What I'm saying to the working professionals out there, I'm not suggesting you should stop working on your craft. What I am suggesting, based on the evidence of everything I've ever learned and everything I ever taught someone, how do you become more valuable to your spouse, to your children, to your company? Focus on your communication skills, your empathy, your ability to feel others' pain. That's right brain, and the school model will not give that to you. So, who do I see then as the people who are exceeding beyond their own expectations? Not because I'm a genius or they listen to me. Full career and life capacity. Left side competence, right side communication and empathy. But no one will hand it to you. Books like The Moment That Defines Your Life, I'd like to think I have one of them, but I've had other books that have an extraordinary impact on me, not on my technical competence. I don't need help there. I'll take it if it's given. But if I had to think about what do I need to do better, I can always do communication, empathy, and collaboration, right brain, better, because no one taught me, so I got to teach myself.
Yeah. And it's also an ever-changing skill set because the people that you're using it with are different, right? And they're changing. So there isn't really mastering those particular things because it's going to be different every single time you're in front of somebody who you're using those skills with as well. But you know what's interesting to me about this is I preach all the time about working on yourself, and it's more about the who than the what, because again, you go to your skill set, you are only as good as who you are as the executor, not the actual skill. But I think we're trained, right, to go, well, the skill is what gets the result. So therefore, I have to be better at the skill. But the piece that we're talking about today is really like, and I'm searching for the word, the foundation, the footings, right, to even use that skill. If you don't have that, your skill is so much less valuable.
Angie, I teach at Columbia Engineering for one reason. The companies that come to recruit our engineers and scientists said to my dean many, many years ago, you, Columbia, are sending us very good engineers. And then you heard the but. Yeah. But when we ask them to do non-engineering things, they're not very good at it. And it's not because they can't naturally become better communicators and more empathetic. It's because nobody either taught them or they dismissed those skills as irrelevant. What happens, and we established then 7 years ago, a program called Professional Development in Leadership. We teach all of the competencies you and I are talking about. What is the common thread to my engineering students when they go out in the world? world. They come back, and time again, I hear it. Chuck, you know what? The engineering, it's easy. It's the people that are hard. It's navigating the unpredictability, the emotional responses, the human behaviors I never would have expected. I don't have a model for how to react to someone who is emotionally hijacked. I didn't even know what it was or that you could even solve the problem. So let's, all of us as human beings, as we think about what do we spend most of our day doing, interacting with people. Even if you're building a bridge or you're doing heart or brain surgery. I've been in operating rooms with the doctors. They got 12 people they're working with. Yeah, he knows how to open up and close and all that. But what do? They collaborate as a team to solve the problem. My entire career has been built around a foundation of collaboration. All that time pounding math and formulas into my head at Syracuse University, all right, I learned something, but nobody taught me the importance of when I walk into a room, my value is my capacity to collaborate, to work across, up, down, everywhere. And that's what I teach. And that's where the moment that defines your life was written to be the emotional companion to my first book, A Climb to the Top, a very tactical toolkit. Well, what happens now that you are equipped in the tools? That equips the mind. Let's equip the heart and the right side of your mind. So let's complete the biology that is already there, but nobody's helping you to develop it except me and you and other people that recognize the importance of self-development, because when we develop ourselves, I think we become better spouses. We become better at our careers. It cuts across. It's not one thing. It's in every aspect of our life. And I ask people, don't separate this. You go home and you shut the Chuck switch off, and then you go to work and you turn the Chuck switch on. That's insanity, and it's exhausting. Instead, learn these behavioral frameworks and apply them to your spouse at dinner, to the big meeting that you had, when you're up on a stage, when you're working with many people. All human interactions are equally unpredictable, no matter who, what the circumstance is. So if we learn one operating model for behavior, we use those behaviors in careers, at home, it doesn't matter. And that's my point of the book. Don't look at a self-help book as either for home or work. Think of it as a life development book that can apply to any situation, no matter the circumstance.
That's super important. I literally was just at a company the other day, and we were talking about, took the Enneagram assessment, and people are like, well, it was kind of hard to assess. Like, am I answering from like my professional self or my personal self? And I'm like, okay, here's our work, right?
Yes.
You don't like oneself. There's not a professional and a personal version of you. We want that authenticity and the genuineness all the time. But what I'm hearing from you, which is, I think you answered the question without even answering it directly, your books are almost like the right and left brain. You know, your first book is very left brain oriented, right? And this book is the right brain. And so bringing these two together truly sets people up for leadership, kind of bringing this back to that area. And not to mention the fulfillment, right? You go back to the ABCs of, you know, belonging and cause and agency. It really does address all this. Like, this is how we get more fulfillment out of life. This is also, if I can be so bold, how we start to stand out against AI. Everyone's like fearing the AI, right? And it's like,
thank you for bringing that up.
We cannot be as smart as AI. You know what I mean? We're not going to be smarter as far as the left brain is concerned from the competition of, you know, a computer. But we have this whole other area to embrace and to use and to move and contribute with that makes us stand out. So it seems like an ideal time to learn it.
Indeed. In fact, when I start my emotional intelligence classes, what I talk about is intelligence, and I ask them to rethink what intelligence means. And with all of the infatuation on artificial intelligence, the one aspect of intelligence that has always been around, that always will be around and is often neglected that I wish the world had the same level of infatuation, and that's called emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
All of you out there, and I say that, you're all intelligent. Do you think you need to be more intelligent than the other person? Well, let's think about intelligence on a series of different platforms, so to speak. Your intellect is one form, your emotional is another, your AQ, another quotient, your adaptability quotient. That's another Q that is being taught as a social science. So we now have IQ, we have EQ, we have AQ, we have cultural intelligence, cross-cultural intelligence, we have communication intelligence, execution intelligence. Yet everyone's talking about AI. To me, no offense to AI, we haven't even mastered the other ones. And we're so busy going on to the one that sits inside a machine. Well, what about the one that sits inside our hearts? That is part of our mind. Why are we negating that? Well, because it's not as fun. It doesn't live on an app. Well, we're an app. We are the app.
Right.
It's easy. Yeah, just get them phone and button. So I appreciate that, Angie. But when I think about it, what I hope the moment that defines your life, for those who have the time and I hope the inclination for that self-development, recognize this redefines what it means to be smart, what it means to be a better person, a better working professional, a better father, a better mother, whatever that is. I think we're so caught up, not in the wrong kind of intelligence, but the one that's getting the news. I feel we have bypassed the most important ones that make us human, and that's emotional intelligence. And I wanted to combine it with the philosophy of stoicism because it's these small behaviors all day long that people notice, both standing out as, oh my God, this guy, this woman, she's so calm under the weight of pressure, or standing out the other way. Yeah, they're technically competent. They can't take the heat. I can't put a person in that job who can't handle the pressure. They work both sides. That's what we talk about when we talk about other people. We generally don't talk about, God, they're good engineers. There's a million of them. We talk about, wow, look at the way she showed up, the way he looked me in the eye. She listened to me. She saw me. She understood me. These are the virtues that will never go away. Yet we're somehow so mindful of the other virtues. I think we're dismissing and ignoring the most important ones.
Agreed, but I think that's coming full circle. I think that there's a push to go back to that. Absolutely. There's a craving for it. We've overshot in some areas and people are wanting something different. So I'm grateful that you wrote the book for people to learn more about it. This is the book, The Moment That Redefines Your Life. It's a great, great read. I like to think of books like this as almost like 10xing the skill set that you have. And it really does, it does make a huge difference. So I hope everyone grabs a copy. And Chuck, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your wisdom on this topic, and appreciate you being here.
Angie, I am grateful always for the opportunity to collaborate with you, but most important to all of our listeners, thank you. And for those that read The Moment That Defines Your Life, I really appreciate that. But I want you to think about everything for your change is within your control. And so think about, I'm going to leave the parting words. Yesterday I was clever and I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. If you want to change the world, start with yourself. And if you start there, no better place.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thank you, Angie. All the best. My pleasure.